Good day. The last couple of hours, or perhaps days, in terms of the fighting in Ukraine, has been dominated by a lot of discussion on the internet and elsewhere about what happened at the Russian military airfield in Saki, which is of course located in Crimea. An explosion, or series of explosions, took place there on the 9th of August, damaging apparently 8 aircraft, some say 9, and of course there's been a lot of discussion as to what caused these explosions. Now, this does remind me a little bit of the episode with the Moskva, the Russian cruiser, missile cruiser that sunk in the Black Sea back in April. Again, there was a lot of discussion and argument as to exactly what caused the destruction of the Moskva. The Ukrainians outright claimed that they had sunk the Moskva with missile strikes with Neptune anti-ship missiles. The Russians said that it was all caused by an internal explosion, but they didn't explain what had actually caused this explosion. Well, this time, it's interesting to say that the Russians have outright denied that there was any kind of Ukrainian military action against this airfield in Saki. They said that there were no missile strikes on the airfield in Saki, and they seem to have poured cold water on the idea that there was some kind of Ukrainian sabotage attack on the airfield in Saki. Officially, the Ukrainians agree. They too deny that there was any kind of Ukrainian military action against the airfield in Saki. They too seem to go along with the Russian claim that this was an accident caused by someone's negligence. Unofficially, of course, Ukrainian officials have been spreading across the media, busy telling everybody that Ukraine was in some way involved, though they don't explain how. Well, I think we can say a few things. There was a lot of people near to the airfield, and there's quite a lot of film of the explosions, and quite a few eyewitnesses. And there is universal denial that any sort of missile strike seems to have taken place against this airfield. So if there was no missile strike, and no Ukrainian missile system that we know of has the range to strike at Saki, which is 200 kilometers from the front line, then that can only leave, or so it seems to me, the possibility of negligence, which is what the Russians say caused the explosion, or some kind of sabotage attack by Ukrainian operatives operating in Crimea. Now, I think the second is a possibility, and I mean, I have to say this because I think it would be a very, very difficult operation to pull off. But about a week or so ago, there was a Ukrainian drone attack on the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. It's a small drone that managed to hit the building of the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. No significant damage was done. A few people suffered minor injuries. But it's conceivable, I suppose, that something similar was carried out against this airfield. Either some kind of drone was sent over the airfield and dropped some kind of explosive device on this ammunition dump. Everybody accepts that the primary explosions were caused by an ammunition dump. Or alternatively, perhaps somebody working inside the base is sympathetic to the Ukrainian cause and engaged in some kind of act of sabotage. I have to say that if it was an act of sabotage by Ukraine, then that would suggest a very significant breach of security on the part of the Russians. It would mean that they're not operating airfield security in what is, after all, a battle area with anything like the necessary levels of efficiency. And I would have thought that would be a serious concern for the Russian military authorities. I am not sure, however, that that was the case, and I have to say that on balance, I think it is more likely that it was in fact caused by by negligence. I'm going to read here what has been written to me in a private email by someone who I understand does have a military background and who does seem to understand what they're talking about. And I think this is as good a discussion of the incident at Saki as any other. This email says, the airfield blasts from visible signs appear to be ammunition detonations. Ammunition is stored in secure places and even under local guard. There were both bombs and missiles. There are both bombs and missiles on any airfield. Airfields under war conditions have multiple layers of visual and human guards. Perimeter security and access is controlled. There is a quick response team and SOPs. I'm not quite sure what SOPs are. No doubt somebody can explain, but anyway, there we go. Standard operating procedures. Oh, I see. There is a quick response and standard operating procedures. Since no missile strike is reported, as it is out of range of Ukrainian forces, whilst the Russian Federation insists it was ammunition detonation, the possibility is either someone who had access to a secure area, and then this person then goes on to say, since a number of aircraft were damaged as reported, it means that it was in close vicinity, the ammunition was in close vicinity to parked aircraft. Ammunition is not near aircraft unless a truck has brought it to load the planes. This gives credence to the theory that a small detachment was loading a fighter jet with bombs, missiles, etc. from a loaded truck when the mishap happened. It is very plausible, as the death-cum-injury rate is low and damage is mostly from exploding ammunition all around indiscriminately. The Ukrainians are likely just taking credit to heap insult to injury. And I think this is probably as good an explanation as any. In other words, there was a serious lapse on the part of people who were Russian engineers, maintenance people who were loading aircraft with bombs or missiles. And in fact, the aircraft that were damaged or destroyed in the blast, we're told, was 5 Sukhoi 24 fighter bombers and 3 much more modern Sukhoi 30 fighter bombers, which is consistent with them being parked on this airfield to be loaded with ammunition. And it looks as if somebody wasn't handling the ammunition properly, and the result was that a detonation took place, and that led to a series of detonations and explosions, damaging the aircraft and causing the damage that we've seen on the satellite pictures. That seems to me as good an operating hypothesis as any. Anybody who wants to comment further is welcome to, but it's entirely likely that the Ukrainians here are simply taking credit for something that they're not directly responsible for. And note that in contrast with the Moskva affair, the Ukrainians officially are not taking credit for what has happened, for what happened. Officially, they are denying that they were involved, even if unofficially they are claiming that they were. Now, it's understandable perhaps that the Ukrainians would want to take credit for what has been happening in Crimea, because it conveniently distracts attention from the fact that the situation on the battlefields is going very badly for them. Firstly, we had an extraordinary admission or comment, I'm not sure whether it was an admission, but a comment from Mikhail Podolyak, who is an advisor to Zelensky's office, and he talked about the great Kherson counteroffensive, which we've been hearing so much about, but which appears to have been postponed yet again. And in an interview with the BBC, Mr. Podolyak is reported to have said, was it an information psychological operation? Of course, today all public comments are part of the information psychological operation. We need to demoralize the Russian army. They must understand that there will always be a territory of fire here. So that appears to suggest, and has been taken by most people, including, by the way, myself, to suggest that there is in fact no Kherson counteroffensive in preparation anytime soon, and that what we've been hearing is, well, Mr. Podolyak calls it an information psychological operation. I would call it a propaganda campaign. Now, if that is right, if that is true, if this has all been a myth, this Kherson counteroffensive has been a myth, then that would be an extraordinarily cynical game that has been played by the Ukrainian authorities, not with the Russian military, obviously, but with their own people, with their own military, and of course with the Western public. All of them have been fed for weeks and months. As I said, I can say that I first read about a Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kherson region back in March. They've been fed for months with reports about this Kherson counteroffensive, and if it's not happening, and it was all some kind of public relations exercise, then frankly, as I said, that's a very cynical game, and the people who are likely to be demoralized by it are not the Russian military, but the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian public, and the Western public, including perhaps, and most importantly, Western media reporters, who must increasingly feel that they've been led up the garden path by the Ukrainians yet again. And coming on top of the ghost of Kiev, the heroic defense of Snakes Island by border guards, all of these stories that have been spread at various points of the war, I think this would be another very damaging blow, perhaps the most damaging blow to Ukrainian credibility. Now, I'm going to say this, I'm a little thinking about it, I'm starting to wonder whether it was really quite as cynical as this, whether perhaps a more plausible explanation for Mr. Podolyak's comments is that the Ukrainians were indeed planning some kind of counteroffensive in Kherson region, or at least the political leadership in Kiev, under urgings from the British, were planning some kind of counteroffensive in Kherson region, but that this idea has had to be postponed or called off entirely because of advice from the Ukrainian military that it would fail, and fail disastrously. So in light of that, we now have the cover story that no such offensive was planned at all, that it was all some part of some information psychological war against the Russians. That seems to me the most plausible explanation for this affair. And that might explain something else, by the way. Why, yet again, the latest bulletin from the British Ministry of Defence gives absolutely no information about events on the battlefields in Ukraine. Instead, it has a somewhat bizarre and indeed weird story about the fact that Belarus has developed its own version of the T-72 tank, which is unsurprising. Belarus has its own military-industrial complex. It's produced its own infantry fighting vehicles, for example. It's an exporter of military hardware, so why wouldn't it produce its own version of the T-72 battle tank? But anyway, the British Ministry of Defence says that this is proof that Russia has suffered such heavy losses of tanks that it can't fulfill export orders, and that this is somehow proof of a crisis that the Russian military industries are themselves of a crisis in the Russian military industries. I mean, it's a ludicrous extrapolation from a minor event, and it does seem to me to be an attempt to fill a gap in reporting of what's actually going on the actual battlefield, where the news has been very bad for Ukraine. And events over the last few hours have been extremely bad because they report significant Russian advances all around the key city of Bakhmut. Now, the major advance up to now in Bakhmut has been by this Wagner group, which is, as I've said previously, a somewhat mysterious outfit made up of former members of the Russian armed forces who operate in some kind of cooperate under contract as part of what is supposed to be a private company. And as I said previously, I think that fiction that the Wagner group is somehow independent of the Russian military, this war has essentially dispelled that myth. But anyway, these are apparently highly trained, very experienced soldiers. They broke into the eastern part of Bakhmut city some days ago, and apparently they've now advanced further, and they've reached something called the Ponds area, whatever that is, which is supposedly somewhere in the central areas of Bakhmut city. So we can see that the fighting in Bakhmut is getting closer to the central areas of Bakhmut city. And there have been also significant Russian advances to the north and south of Bakhmut. And the overall impression I'm getting is that Bakhmut is becoming increasingly isolated and is coming under pressure. The Russians have captured to the south of Bakhmut, or at least are in the process of capturing an important settlement called Zaitsevo, which apparently will enable them to take various steps to engulf Bakhmut. And there's also been significant Russian advances through the industrial zone of Soledar. This is the northern suburb of Bakhmut, which where a short time ago the Russians captured the large Knauf factory, and the Russians appear to be capturing more factory areas of Soledar, and they also control some of its eastern pressings. And the overall impression is of an intensification of the pace, the momentum of advance in and around Bakhmut city. And further south, opposite Donetsk, one is also getting some reports of further Russian advances from Persky, this fortified settlement that the Russians captured, or largely captured. There's some reports that there's some Ukrainian holdouts in its northern pressings that the Russians largely captured a short time ago, that they seem to have pushing north from Persky as they now try to enfold more of the Ukrainian fortifications opposite Donetsk. Now, having said that, as I said, it is the crisis, the growing crisis that the Ukrainians are facing around Bakhmut, which is probably the most important aspect of this battle up to this point, because of course Bakhmut, as I've said, is the linchpin of the Ukrainian defense lines, running from Siversk in the north all the way down to Bakhmut in the south, which act as the last remaining shield before the Russians reach Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and the centers around it, where the reserve troops and the headquarters of the Ukrainian army in Donbass is located. And by the way, I've noticed that some commentators have now started to refer to this defense line from Siversk in the north to Bakhmut in the south as the Zelensky line, implying that President Zelensky has had something to do with it. Well, I don't know whether that is true or not, but there have been reports, again, unconfirmed, unverified. These are rumors, but they sound like plausible rumors, that once again General Zaluzhny, the overall military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, has advised President Zelensky that the northern part of this front line, the town of Siversk, should be abandoned, that all the troops holding Siversk should be withdrawn, and importantly, apparently, he's advising that they should not be withdrawn to Soledar and Bakhmut, which obviously he expects to fall fairly soon and perhaps to be cut off from resupply very soon as a result of all of these Russian advances, but to be pulled back to Kramatorsk, which is, I understand, the biggest town in Donbass, still under Ukrainian control, and where I believe the overall headquarters of the Ukrainian military in Donbass is located. So that supposedly is General Zaluzhny's advice to President Zelensky. Now, there's been many reports that General Zaluzhny has advised withdrawals from other undefendable places in the past. Apparently he gave the same advice to Zelensky to withdraw from places like Severodonetsk and Lysychansk earlier in the Battle of Donbass. Apparently he advised Zelensky that those two towns, that urban agglomeration which these two towns constituted, that area was undefendable. He was overruled. It's quite likely he will be overruled again, but it seems he is giving that advice, or at least these reports suggest he is, and if so, that perhaps gives us some indication of how critical the situation for the Ukrainians around Bakhmut is becoming. Bakhmut, by the way, is a largish place. It had a pre-war population of around 70,000. So if it falls, it is another town, and of course Zelensky or his officials said after the fall of Lysychansk that Lysychansk would be the last Ukrainian town to fall to the Russians in this war. And of course, if Bakhmut does fall, and by the way, it's a place which Zelensky has visited in some of his frontline tours, well, I think it will be a significant psychological blow as well as a military blow as well. It will reinforce the belief amongst many people in Ukraine that they are now conclusively losing the war. So, bad news for Ukraine on the Bakhmut front, bad news on the battlefields, and it looks increasingly as if this Kherson offensive, and today when I'm making this video is the 11th of August, so the time to launch this offensive before the autumn closes in is ticking away. It's going away. It seems as if this Kherson offensive may not happen, or after all, or at least it isn't happening for the moment. Just a few small things. The Military Summary Channel made a claim that the railway and road bridge across the dam in Novaya Kharkova has now been cut off. I think that is wrong. I think that was based upon a claim made some time ago by the British Ministry of Defence in one of its bulletins. I think the Russians have always denied that claim, and I think it is almost certainly untrue. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, I am not sure if once the so-called Zelensky line, if we can call it that, from Siversk to Bakhmut collapses. I'm not sure that the area around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is really suitable for creating some kind of defense line. I would have thought the answer is probably not. I don't think that this was ever intended to be a line of defense by Ukraine. I think rather it was the reserve area where the reserve forces that Ukraine had deployed in Donbass to support the front lines was located. And there no doubt the Ukrainians are now busy trying to build whatever fortifications they can. I doubt that they will be as complex and as elaborate as the ones that the Russians have already broken through. So it may be that the battle for Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, when it comes, will be shorter than some of the other battles we have seen in Donbass. Anyway, that's where we are on the military side of things. Now, a few further points to say. The EU, incredibly, is now once again apparently considering a seventh sanctions package against Russia. This despite the fact that the Wall Street Journal is now reporting that the EU has run out of effective sanctions that it can impose, and that there's growing complaints and pushback from European politicians. It doesn't quite say which European politicians, but it refers to France, that these sanctions are now causing real harm to the European economy, and that they're not achieving their intended purpose with respect to Russia, and that far from sustaining or persisting in this sanctions war, the better policy is to start to pull back and to reverse it. Well, to some extent, of course, that has already happened. We've seen that the EU has effectively ended its attempts to obstruct Russian agricultural and fertilizer exports, and that it's also relaxed some of its exports on shipping of Russian oil. Remember that there was supposed to be an insurance ban coming into effect in December, and now that apparently is being postponed. Insurance ban on shipping Russian oil. Apparently it's no longer going to be worldwide. It's not planned that it should be worldwide. It's only going to be for oil transported on tankers to Britain and perhaps the EU. But oil shipped from Russia to third countries apparently might not be covered by an insurance ban after all. And there's also been some moves to ease sanctions on aviation products. And again, we don't know the full details, but it does seem as if some spare parts are being supplied to Russia after all. And we're now hearing about reports that it's now becoming slightly easier to travel to Russia by air from the European Union than it was a few weeks ago. Having said that, the EU nonetheless is still apparently considering another package of sanctions, despite, as I said, the criticism and the pushback from some European politicians saying that this isn't a good idea at all. And by the way, the Wall Street Journal basically says that these are West European politicians. So this is not Mr. Orban in Hungary, who's obviously an East European politician. Nonetheless, as I said, the seventh sanctions package is being discussed, and there is apparently a provision under consideration which fills me with horror. This is that there is to be apparently, or the discussion is, that there should be a blanket ban on granting of Schengen visas to Russians, so that any Russians will no longer be able to travel to the Schengen zone, to the area, the core area of the European Union. Now, I have to say, I find that absolutely astonishing and outrageous. A blanket ban on Russians to prevent Russians entering the European area, the core European area, seems to be straightforwardly intended, again, to punish Russians. Now, obviously, because of the cut-off of air links, the substantive cut-off of air links, and the huge prices involved if you want to fly from Moscow to Europe, you have to go through various roundabout routes in order to do it. Well, in light of that, there can't be many Russians anyway who want to fly to Europe anymore, but there's still quite a few Russians in the Schengen zone, people who are working, doing all sorts of things, and presumably they're going to be faced with the fact that they will no longer be able to stay in Schengen countries once their visas come up for renewal. And they'll have to spend a huge amount of money which some of them perhaps don't have, in order to get back to Russia. I have to say, I find this absolutely outrageous, punishing people for the actions ultimately of their government. And note that there will be mainly people in Europe, not in Russia itself. And on top of this, I have to say that it's an astonishing, a bizarre reversal from the position during the Cold War. During the Cold War, the Soviet authorities used to come in for a great deal of richly deserved criticism for the fact that they prevented their citizens from travelling outside of the Soviet Union, including, of course, and obviously, to the West. The Soviets imposed heavy, extreme restrictions on the ability of Soviet citizens, Russians, to travel to the West. And this was constantly held up as proof, and rightly so, of the authoritarian nature of the Soviet system. And lots of people were saying that, if Russians were allowed to travel to the West and saw the West for themselves, they'd come back to their own country, they'd be dissatisfied, and some of them, of course, would choose to stay. And this is why the Soviet authorities were preventing them from traveling. And all of that contained a great deal of truth to it. Well, now we're going right to the reverse. Where formerly the West had campaigned to allow Russians to be able to travel outside their countries, there are apparently some European politicians, including apparently members of the German government, and apparently people within the European Commission, and also the Swedish government, who want to prevent Russians from travelling outside their own country, or at least travelling to Europe. And it shows to me a total loss of nerve, and it's also essentially an angry punishment of people because, well, they remain patriotic. They're not taking up arms or protesting against their government. Most Russians support the policy of their government towards Ukraine. They support the war. And this apparently has led to this extraordinary, vindictive, spluttering action against them, or at least the discussion of it. And I have to say, that seems to me counterproductive from every conceivable point of view. It's going to reinforce the feeling that many Russians have that the European leaders are hostile to them, that Western Europe is hostile to them, not as Russians, and it's going to solidify their belief that their government was absolutely right when it did what it did in Ukraine, because it looked as if Western Europe was indeed planning, the Western powers were indeed planning some actions in Ukraine which would have been threatening to Russia itself. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I found it an outrageous, an extraordinary step. It shows an astonishing loss of nerves, And frankly, if this is the only thing that the Europeans can come up with in terms of a sanctions package, then they should drop the whole idea and simply abandon the idea of a seventh sanctions package. In fact, as I've said, they should talk peace. There's talk now that the rivers in Europe are starting to dry up because of the hot summer, that this is going to create more energy problems in the future. If this is all true, then time is well overdue for seeking a settlement. And those European politicians who are reputedly talking about the need for de-escalation are obviously right. Anyway, that's where we are at the moment. We'll see what happens, and that's my video for today. Well, thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can join us on our other platforms, above all Locals, but also Telegram and Rumble and ODYSEE, and of course you can also support us via Patreon and Subscribe Star, and by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there. And in the meantime, please remember to check your subscription to this channel, and also to tick the like button if you've liked this video. That's me for the day. More from me soon, and have a very good day until you listen to me again, whenever that is. Thank you for joining me, and as I said, have a very good day.